Hello, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Rigo Villa, Community Manager on the Cisco Learning Network, and I'll be your host today. In this session, we will be covering endpoint analytics with our presenters for today, Dustin Stocks and Krishnan Thiruvengadam. But before we get started, I wanted to share a couple of quick housekeeping notes. First, I do want to let our attendees know that all of our presenters are currently working from home, so if we do run into any technical issues during the presentation, we'll do our very best to resolve it as soon as possible. So we just want to thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. Next, if you have any questions during the session, we ask that you please post them in the question and answer panel, as that would help our panelists keep track of all of your questions and would also allow them to provide you with a much more timely response. Also, if you experience any audio streaming issues during the live presentation, I do recommend using the call-in telephone number that I'm going to be posting in the chat window here in just a moment. And at the end of this webinar, you will get a pop-up survey with a couple of questions about today's presentation, and we would really appreciate it if you can just take a moment to fill it out and share with us any thoughts or feedback that you may have today. And I also want to let our attendees know that this session will be recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing within about 5 business days after today. I'll be sure to post some more information about that in the chat window a little bit later on. And last but not least, we're going to be launching a couple of poll questions throughout this presentation. And when we are ready to launch one of these polls, we will announce it live, and then you're going to see it pop up on your webinar event screen. And then that's when you'll have an opportunity to submit your answers. So we hope that you all can participate. And with all that said, I am now going to turn it over to our first speaker to get us started. So Dustin, if you're ready, please take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Rigo, for the introduction, and good morning and afternoon and evening to everyone, and thank you for joining. As Rigo mentioned, my name is Dustin Stocks. I am a product manager on the AI Endpoint Analytics team, and joining me today is Krishnan, who is a technical marketing engineer for both ICE and Endpoint Analytics. So between the two of us, hopefully you'll learn something today and get a better idea of, what AI Endpoint Analytics is and how it can help you better utilize ICE and the Cisco ecosystem. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and get started. A brief agenda of what we're going to talk about today. We'll start off by talking about some of the IoT challenges that we see in the marketplace and that we see in customers' networks. We'll go from there into an overview of endpoint analytics. We'll talk about why a solution like endpoint analytics is needed. I'll talk to you about how it functions and some of the key advantages and ways that it can kind of help bolster what is already done in ICE today and give you an even better ability to profile and classify and ultimately segment IoT devices on your network. We'll move then into a demonstration. Krishna is going to walk through an endpoint analytics demo, show you what the UI looks like, and show you how endpoint analytics and ICE work hand in hand to, again, provide you with a better capability to profile endpoints on the network. And then finally, we'll wrap up by introducing a new capability that we're building into endpoint analytics that is known as trust analytics. And I'll talk more in detail about this at the end of the presentation. So to get the things to get our discussion started today, I did want to start with a poll question. So one of the first things we wanted to understand from you is, do you struggle to profile IoT devices on your network? And what I'm trying to drive home here is, when we say IoT devices, we're talking, typically unmanaged, carpeted office IoT devices. Are these things that today you struggle to profile? Do you struggle to, segment these devices? This will help give us a better understanding of some of the problems that you may be facing today in your network. Okay, so we'll move on to another poll question. Let me close this out. Another thing that we'd like to understand is, do you currently have Cisco DNA Center? So maybe you have DNA Center in a lab environment, maybe you have it in production, or perhaps you're not utilizing Cisco DNA Center at all. Again, Endpoint Analytics is an application that runs on Cisco DNA Center. So if you're not familiar with DNA Center, we can talk about very briefly what DNA Center is, and throughout the presentation, you'll get a better understanding of it regardless. Okay, I think time's expired for both of those questions. So Rigo, did we have answers for each?
Yes, thank you, Dustin. So for the first poll, and just a reminder, the question was, do you struggle to profile IoT devices on your network? And our top answer shows that our participants are having a little bit of a struggle there. So definitely yes, to profile IoT. And then for the result of our second poll with the question, do you have Cisco DNA Center? The answers show that the majority of participants have DNA Center in production. So that was our top answer. And then in second place, we have those who said they have it in their lab.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thank you, Rigo. So again, as we go through today's discussion, you will kind of hopefully understand why these poll questions were important. Endpoint analytics is a next generation endpoint profiling tool. So typically when we speak with customers, IoT devices are things that they struggle to profile and properly segment on their network. And then, of course, with it running on DNA Center, it's important to understand, how endpoint analytics works and kind of what are the requirements to deploy this solution. And I'll talk about that in detail later on in the presentation as well. But it's definitely good to know that most of the attendees do have DNA Center already, because that solves one of the requirements. Okay, so we'll move into the beginning of the presentation. And first, I want to talk about some IoT challenges. And this probably will not come as a surprise to many folks on the call, but according to Gartner, by 2025, there's expected to be 25 billion IoT devices connected to the network. So of course, more and more devices continue to proliferate and join onto the network, and this creates a larger and larger attack surface, especially if your network is not properly segmented and you cannot profile these devices that are joining the network. A recent Gartner study found that 83% of imaging devices in healthcare environments are running unsupported operating systems, some of which are still running Windows 7, believe it or not. So not only are IoT devices proliferating and more of them are joining the network, it can become increasingly difficult to monitor and make sure that these devices are running the latest operating systems, latest patches, and things like that. And again, that can lead to an increased attack surface. And finally, that same study found that 98% of IoT traffic is unencrypted, right? So again, the challenge that I want to drive home here is that as more and more devices connect to the network, being able to properly see them, profile them, and segment these devices is absolutely critical to network security. And given those challenges that I spoke about, let's see what happens when a network is not segmented well. And in this example, we have IT users that are communicating with IoT devices. And what can happen when there's ineffective segmentation is that things such as an email-borne attack, 80% of email-borne attacks will result in some sort of cross-contamination in this scenario with IoT devices. And according to the study that found this, the HIMSS study, IoT devices that are running unsupported and outdated operating systems present an even bigger threat when the network is not properly segmented. And this just goes to show that without proper segmentation policy, without the ability to profile IoT devices, an attack such as an email-borne attack, which are very frequent and very common, can lead to cross-contamination and a lot of issues in the network if we're not segmenting it properly. So let's talk in more detail about segmentation and why is it important. And if you look on the slide, the image on the left when we speak with customers is typically what we find that they envision for their network, right? So you want to be able to easily identify and profile all of the users and devices on your network, and then create segmentation and security policy around them. And on the left, we can easily see that we have all of our employees, our building management devices, printers, common services, etc. We've identified them, we know where they are on the network, and we've created segmentation policy that allows only certain entities to communicate with one another. However, the reality is much more like the image on the right, where we are able to profile and identify some users and devices on the network, but there always exists this pool of unknown devices. Sometimes, depending upon the customer's environment, the amount of unknown devices will be small or it can be rather large. And this is where the problem comes in, because if you cannot see the endpoints on your network and profile them, then you're unable to create good segmentation policy around them, even when using a very capable tool such as ICE. So these are, the common problems that we see with segmentation. And we kind of, when we thought about how we could develop a solution to help customers, enact better visibility driven segmentation, these were kind of the three main points and barriers that we identified. And we'll start on the left-hand side of the slide with the first barrier, of course, being a lack of visibility around the endpoints on the network. And I've kind of already alluded to this in the previous slides, but simply put, you cannot protect and segment what you can't see. And if you cannot profile IoT devices and endpoints on the network, then they do pose a significant risk. And so the key barrier to segmentation that we aim to remove with endpoint analytics is that lack of endpoint visibility. And I'll go into detail as to how we actually do this later on in the presentation. Another barrier to segmentation that we find when speaking with customers is that, creating proper segmentation policy and security policy is difficult. And oftentimes, users are concerned with kicking off critical endpoints or kicking critical endpoints off of the network and creating segmentation policy that, breaks the network. So another application that we've developed and that we use with endpoint analytics is policy analytics. And I know it can kind of get confusing with the verbiage, so I'll try to make sure that I don't confuse anyone. But policy analytics is a separate application that runs on Cisco DNA Center. So it's not technically part of endpoint analytics, but it is an application that we work very closely with. And the goal of policy analytics, and you can see it in the image on the center of the slide, is to actually visualize the communication and flows that are occurring between different endpoint groups on your network. So first, we give you visibility into what's on the network, and then we provide this capability to visualize how they're communicating. And the goal here is to enable you to better create segmentation policy and understand how different endpoints and entities are communicating on the network. And then finally, as I introduced earlier, we have what's known as trust analytics. And again, to remove confusion, trust analytics is part of endpoint analytics. It is a new capability that we're building into the product. And our goal here is to help users build context around the endpoints on their network. So knowing what's on the network and understanding what it is solves most of the problems. But this concept of trust analytics will help you understand how trustworthy these devices are. Are they running the latest operating systems? Do they have, open ports that can be exploited? Are they using weak credentials? Those are the type of things that we want to assess. And ultimately, we provide a trust score. And I'll talk more in detail about this later on how we do this and what a trust score is. So again, for the purposes of today's conversation, we're going to talk about endpoint analytics and we're going to talk about trust analytics. Remember that policy analytics is a separate application. And if you're curious and want to learn more about policy analytics, be sure to comment in the chat and we can get you more information on what it is. So we're going to move into endpoint analytics and what it is and how it functions and why it is critical and can really help augment what you're already doing today in ICE when it comes to profiling endpoints. So we see endpoint analytics as the next generation endpoint visibility tool. And the key two functions of endpoint analytics, if you remember, nothing else from today's conversation, remember that endpoint analytics uses AI, machine learning, and deep packet inspection to provide that next phase of endpoint visibility. So, these are the things that endpoint analytics can do above and beyond traditional profiling tools. And these are the two critical things that we use to provide very granular profiling and classification of endpoints on the network. And I'm going to tell you exactly how we do that in a couple of slides. So what is unique about endpoint analytics? We'll start from the left-hand side of the slide. Again, what we aim to do is provide granular profiling of devices. And we do this primarily using deep packet inspection. And I'll walk through an example of this later on. Another key thing that's unique to endpoint analytics is that we're able to use crowdsourcing to help build out our machine learning capabilities. And what crowdsourcing is, you can think of this as all of the customers in our endpoint analytics ecosystem that have deployed our product. As more and more endpoints on their network are profiled, all of those labels and attributes are shared to our machine learning cloud. And this helps us to continue to build out this massive data lake of information around endpoints so that when unique devices connect to the network, we're able to automatically profile those endpoints based on the fact that we've already seen them in other customer environments. And another key point that I don't want to forget is that a lot of the context that we get for profiling does come from ICE. So ICE does bring a very unique capability to the problem, and that it's located more centrally. ICE can talk to Active Directory and MDM. So we do get a lot of context and a lot of context and attributes from ICE that kind of help us provide additional profiling on top of the things that endpoint analytics is able to do. We're able to do this classification based on our ability to see into layer 7 and layer 6 with deep packet inspection. And I'm going to talk in much more detail around some of the other points here on the slide. But the key takeaway here and what is unique about EA again is that we can provide granular profiling using deep packet inspection and machine learning to ultimately help you rapidly reduce the amount of unknown endpoints on your network. That is the end goal for us, is that, if you recall back to that segmentation slide, we want to make that number of unknown endpoints on your network as close to 0 as possible so you can create better segmentation policy around those endpoints. So let's talk through how endpoint analytics actually works. And in the center of your slide, if you look at the circle, that circle shows the actual functionality of endpoint analytics and what we're doing behind the scenes. Along the bottom, we have what we call our endpoint telemetry sources. And first and foremost, looking on the left-hand side, we have DPI, or deep packet inspection. Again, this is our critical part of our solution and is what gives us that ability to look into the layer 7 and 6 part of the packet and identify different protocols that endpoints are using to communicate. And ultimately, this is what allows us to build out what we call a multi-factor classification table that I'll talk to in the next slide. Network telemetry probes, this is ICE. This is the context that we're getting and information that we're getting from ICE. So ICE, again, is a critical part of our solution. And again, that context that ICE is able to provide endpoint analytics helps us profile devices. Easy onboarding tools, think of this as the ability for you as the user to go in and perhaps, upload a CSV, or perhaps you want to manually input endpoints into the inventory yourself. So if that's something that you want to do as a user, then we have easy onboarding tools that will allow you to do so. And then finally, we have the connection with CMDB, or Configuration Management Database. Today, we have an integration with ServiceNow, which is the most popular CMDB that we see amongst customers. So if you are a ServiceNow customer, we can pull in that information from ServiceNow into endpoint analytics to help us profile all the IoT devices on your network. So again, the functionality and what's going on is in the center. And using these sources that you see along the bottom of the slide, the first thing we do is we aggregate all of this data, right? And what happens when we do that is, if you see that circle with the 2 question marks on the left, those were all of those unknown endpoints on the network. And then we aggregated all of that data. And as a result, endpoint analytics is now able to profile those devices and tell you, in this example, we see an IP phone, we have what looks like to be an iPad, we have an IP camera, and now we've been able to profile these previously unknown devices. And then, let's say we have a scenario where after we aggregate the data and we profile, we're still unable to identify the endpoint. That is when the machine learning part of the product kicks in, and I'm going to talk to that in a little bit more detail in a couple of slides. So I alluded to this table, and at the end of the day, once endpoints are profiled, we classify them into 4 buckets. And those 4 buckets are device type, hardware model, hardware manufacturer, and operating system. And these are the 4 independent labels that we aim to provide for all of the endpoints on your network. So in this example, a CT scanner would be the device type. The hardware model would be Optima CT540. The manufacturer would be GE. And we would also be able to tell you that the operating system that this particular CT scanner is running is Linux in this example. So, this is the multi-factor classification table. And again, all of the endpoints that we profile using endpoint analytics are categorized into these 4 buckets. And as you'll see later on, we share these attributes with ICE, which is what, of course, will allow you within ICE to create the authorization and policies using these attributes to segment these endpoints. So let's talk about 2 of the key functionalities that I spoke to earlier, which is deep packet inspection and machine learning. In this example on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see that we have a Globex CT scanner. And what would typically happen is if you were using a traditional profiling tool, you have some probes in the network and you're going to gain some information, perhaps using DHCP around this particular endpoint. And most often, this device is going to be classified as a Microsoft workstation. And that's because it's running Windows 7. So typically, a traditional profiling tool is going to identify this as a Windows workstation. But in this example, we have the benefit of knowing that this is not a Windows workstation. This is actually a CT scanner. So we have to come up with a way to gain more context and information around this endpoint. And that's exactly what endpoint analytics does. So if you're using endpoint analytics, what we're able to do is use deep packet inspection. And deep packet inspection is something that is powered by NBAR. And NBAR is network-based application recognition. And this is an engine that is embedded natively on the Catalyst 9000 series infrastructure. And using deep packet inspection, we can gain some insights and visibility into the layers 7 and 6 part of the packet. And in this particular example, we see that this endpoint is communicating using a protocol known as DICOM. And using our application library, we know that DICOM is a protocol that is used by medical devices. So utilizing that information and other context that we're getting from ICE, we are able to fill out that multi-factor classification table that I alluded to earlier and tell you that this device is a Globex CT scanner running Microsoft Windows 7. So again, hopefully this example kind of shows you, why deep packet inspection is important, and as a result, how DPI gives us that granular profiling ability and ultimately allows us to fill out these 4 attributes for this particular endpoint. And again, that deep packet inspection is done natively on the Catalyst 9000 infrastructure. And we also have a separate appliance that you can utilize in the event that you do not have Cat 9Ks. And I'll talk about our deployment models that we support in a couple of slides. So let's walk through an example of how the machine learning in endpoint analytics works. So starting from the left-hand side, again, if you'll remember, the first thing that we do is we aggregate data utilizing those 4 telemetry sources. And at that point, we will perform the profiling, and all of the devices that we have profiles for and we're able to profile from the initial start, those will be sent up to the device data lake that is hosted on DNA Center. But what happens when we still have unknown devices? In this example, we have 2 different groups of unknown endpoints, right? We'll see this group of green circles and this group of orange circles. And what happens at this point is that our machine learning is automatically going to group these unknown endpoints based on a common set of attributes. And what it is going to do is it's going to present a rule to the user that states, hey, these particular devices, while they're unknown, we can see that they're similar based on their attributes. And in this example, think of this as the machine learning at this point, does not understand what these endpoints are. So the user will be presented with the opportunity to teach the machine learning that yes, in fact, these two different groups of endpoints are similar, and the previously unknown group of orange devices are Bosch coffee machines, and the group of unknown green devices were Apple Watches. So in this example, it's important to point out that again, the user is helping teach the machine learning algorithm what these particular profiles are. And as a result, the machine learning is going to learn these new labels around these endpoints. So in a future scenario, when additional Bosch coffee machines connect to the network, the machine learning cloud is automatically going to recognize them, and it's going to propose to the user that, hey, based on the profile that we're seeing, we think that these are Bosch coffee machines. And at this point, of course, the user can confirm, yes, these are Bosch coffee machines, or no, they are not. And at that point, again, that same process will repeat where the user would teach and label the endpoints themselves. So again, I alluded to crowdsourcing earlier on in the presentation as one of the things that are very unique to endpoint analytics. And again, I'll touch on it in the fact that as more and more customers continue to deploy endpoint analytics and we profile more and more endpoints, this automatic process of the machine learning is gaining traction. It is becoming more powerful, and we have the ability to automatically profile more devices from day zero on your network. So we've talked a lot about how endpoint analytics functions. It's of course important to communicate, and I think I see some questions coming up in the chat as to what is required to actually deploy endpoint analytics. So we'll start off with Cisco DNA Center. Again, endpoint analytics is an application that runs on DNA Center. So the minimum requirement that you'll need is 2.1.2.4. And from a licensing perspective, you do need DNA Advantage licensing to deploy and take advantage of endpoint analytics. Obviously, everyone on this call is a Cisco ICE user. While ICE is not technically a hard requirement for endpoint analytics, you can deploy endpoint analytics on its own with DNA Center if you're just interested in gaining visibility. However, that is typically not a common use case because, of course, customers and users want to gain visibility and then actually be able to do something about it. So, of course, ICE is the cornerstone for segmentation. It's the cornerstone in single point of truth. And it's where, policies are actually created and acted. And in terms of ICE, 2.4 patch 11 plus, 2.6 patch 5 and up, and 2.7 patch 1 and up. So we support many different versions of ICE. In terms of infrastructure, again, if you'll remember, I alluded to the CAT 9000 infrastructure being able to natively perform deep packet inspection. So in terms of wired infrastructure, Catalyst 92.3 and 9400 are supported. And from wireless, we do support the Catalyst 9800 wireless LAN controller. And in terms of versioning, 17.3.1 for iOS is the minimum. And then in a scenario where you do not have Catalyst 9000 infrastructure, we do have a separate appliance that is called the DNA Traffic Telemetry Appliance. And I'll go ahead and advance to the next slide so you can kind of get a visual representation of what I'm speaking through. The TTA, for short, is able to do the same deep packet inspection job that a Cat 9K does natively. So let's say you have a network where you have legacy Cisco switching, you have third-party devices, or there's just a portion of your network where you don't have Catalyst 9Ks. In that scenario, you would have to deploy the traffic telemetry appliance at the distribution layer. And what you would do is you would span traffic from the access and distribution layer to that traffic telemetry appliance. And at that point, the TTA is going to do the same thing that a Cat 9K would do. And BAR is going to perform that deep packet inspection, pass that telemetry up to endpoint analytics. And then, of course, after endpoint analytics profiles and classify these endpoints, we share that information with ICE, where, of course, the policy is created and then sent down to the infrastructure for enforcement. So in terms of deployment scenarios, there are two different deployment scenarios that we support. Again, the easiest and ideal is if you have Cat 9K infrastructure, you have DNA center licensing and ICE, you have everything you need to take advantage of endpoint analytics. And in the event that you don't have Cat 9Ks, again, we can deploy this traffic telemetry appliance and span traffic and accomplish the same outcome. So let's talk about policy enforcement using ICE. And what does all this mean for ICE? Because of course that is, what you're interested in. If you'll remember earlier, I talked about the multi-factor classification table and the fact that we classify endpoints into those 4 buckets: device type, hardware model, operating system, and manufacturer. And on the left-hand side, you can see those 4 buckets and profiles. And if you look on the right, you'll see that these profiles in corresponding value pairs are shared with ICE. Right? So again, endpoint analytics shares this information and profiling with ICE, which of course, then you can use to create your authorization policies. And once ICE receives that information from endpoint analytics, you have to do 2 key things. And the first thing you have to do is create a custom profile policy. And the second thing that you have to do is create an authorization policy and add this custom profile policy within the construct of that authorization policy. And one of the things to remember here is to have the maximum weight for this custom profile policy. And we do recommend that you try this out in your lab with some endpoints first before deploying this into production. And when you create that authorization policy, it's going to look like something like you see on the screen here. So if endpoint policy is Cisco iPhone, then assign SGT10. And in this scenario, if endpoint policy is iPhone, this is the endpoint policy that is being used. And then assign SGT10 is the result of that condition. You can also assign ACLs and VLANs. So that's an important thing to point out as well. And then coming soon, this is a new and exciting capability that we'll have with ICE 3.1 and then the upcoming release of DNA Center, which is known internally as Shockwave. What I talked about on the previous slide, where an ICE admin has to spend hours going in and creating these custom profile policies, what's going to happen with ICE 3.1 and Shockwave is that we're going to automatically share these endpoint classifications over the new PX grid topic. And what that's going to do is it's going to eradicate the need for you to go in and do profile reclassification. So as a result, this will save an ICE admin a ton of time and remove one of those previous steps that I talked about on the previous slide, where you have to go in and do that reclassification of endpoint profiles. So that'll automatically be done for you and shared over that PX grid topic. So that's a key improvement to call out that'll be upcoming soon. So I've talked a lot about the ecosystem and what endpoint analytics is, and of course you're familiar with ICE. So this slide just goes to show you visually how the entire solution fits together. So starting on the left, we have a bunch of different endpoints that are authorizing and connecting to the network. In this example, we see 802.1x, we see MAB. And of course, these endpoints are going to communicate with the infrastructure. In this example, the switch is going to pass that information on to DNA Center on the bottom portion of the slide. Endpoint analytics is going to profile these endpoints utilizing DPI, utilizing the context that we have coming in from ICE. We're going to create that multi-factor classification table and labels. Those are going to be shared up to ICE, where again, of course, you will use those labels to create policies, which is then sent down to the infrastructure for actual enforcement. So again, hopefully this just kind of gives you a visual representation of how everything is occurring, again, all the way from the endpoints connecting to the network to ICE getting the context from endpoint analytics and labels, and then creating that policy and then sending it on down to the switching. So now hopefully you have a better understanding of what endpoint analytics is and what capabilities that we're able to deliver on top of what ICE is able to do today. Again, it's important to call out that ICE is very important in our ability to profile endpoints, and that integration with ICE and endpoint analytics is very strong. And to show you that, we're now going to pass it on over to Krishnan, and Krishnan is going to walk you through a demonstration of endpoint analytics and show you how it works with ICE. So with that being said, Krishnan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dustin. Let me share my screen and we'll go from there. Can you all see my screen clearly? Hear me as well?
Yeah, we can see it, Krishnan.
Excellent, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, based on wherever you are. Endpoint analytics, as Dustin said, is an application that sits in DNA Center, right? I saw there was a question if DNA Center is a service. Right now, it's an appliance, right? And once you host these, the application, it'll be available under policy, AI endpoint analytics. And when you click that, and you will see the screen, you'll get to this overview screen. And this is kind of a dashboard, you could say. And it'll show you the total number of endpoints and endpoints that are unknown, missing profiles, fully profiled. And endpoint analytics actually uses 4 different categories to profile, or labels: endpoint type, manufacturer, model, operating system. Even if you miss one single profile type, then it'll be categorized under missing profiles. And that's why you see that there are 27 missing profiles and 7 fully per profile. Again, this is my test system, and there are lots of test devices, VMs, and all that. And anything that we are not able to classify, it'll be categorized under unknown. Right? We talked about also AI ML, like how endpoint analytics intuitively groups the endpoint based on common set of attributes, and then give you an idea about those groups. And that's the AI proposals here, right? The main section where a lot of us, a lot of admins, and a lot of folks would spend is the endpoint inventory page. In the endpoint inventory page, and it'll actually list the, let me sort through. Okay, it'll list the number of endpoints, and it'll give you an idea about what these endpoints are. MAC address in the next releases, you will also see the IP address. The idea is that you'll be able to see the labels as well as identify the endpoints from here. Now, using deep packet inspection, we will be able to capture a lot of information from these devices. Say, for example, if you are a healthcare customer, and if there is a CT scanner that is added to the network, right, and that is accessing the network. So what we do is we gather tons of information from these endpoints, and especially unmanaged endpoints, and you can see the different protocols that are used to gather the asset information. Especially for healthcare, we use something called DICOM and HL7, which are unique protocols in the healthcare environment itself. Now, when you click on DICOM, and you can see that we are parsing through these protocol attributes to identify that this is a CT scanner, especially like the DICOM modality, model name, manufacturer, and all that. Now, using this, we will be able to easily identify that this is an endpoint type, full body CT scan, hardware model, manufacturer, and so on. So now, how do you send this information over to ICE? And there was a question in the chat. Now, we are sending currently in this release of DNA Center, we would be sending this information using the asset attributes. And this is what we do, like asset device type, hardware revision, IP address, vendor, and so on and so. So this is sent via the PX grid, and ICE and DNA Center are connected together using pxgrid, and this information is sent over to ICE. And in ICE, you need to create a custom profile as of now, right? And then you would use these attributes inside the custom profile. Now, there's one more example I wanted to give you is the IP phone. And this is a standard IT device. And Endpoint Analytics is able to identify that. And we are able to use the IoT asset dictionary, IoT asset grouping to send this information over to ICE. And now you can see that this is a Cisco IP phone 9971. The MAC address, IP address, software revision is nothing but the model. I'm sorry. So software revision is the operating system, and asset vendor is the manufacturer. Okay. Please remember this, because when we go to ICE, I will show you this. I will show you how to use these attributes to create a custom profile and how to create an authorization policy in ICE using these custom profile itself. Okay. Now, this is one half of it. One half of it is where you are able to identify and classify, profile and label the endpoints based on these four different categories, right? And one is using deep packet inspection, and the other sources from ICE would be Active Directory, MDM, and if you have Active Directory, MDM, any connecting, we will be augmenting the information here using those other sources which are very unique to ICE itself. Okay. Excuse me. Now, let's go back to the overview section, and I wanted to show you how the AI/ML works. When you click on the review section, and you can see that AI/ML intuitively groups these endpoints and based on common set of attributes, right? And here you see that the OUI is Residio, the DHCP classifier, Residio thermostat, and we are able to identify this group of endpoints. Say, for example, you have connected a group of Residio thermostats to your network, and DPI is catching up, and it's so AI/ML will be able to intuitively identify these things and based on this grouping and behavior. And you can, this is a wizard that walks you through how the way to classify these endpoints in a relatively easy way, right? When you click next, it'll automatically create a profiling rule for this Residio group of thermostats with all these attribute values. And then you click next, and the admin has to type in the rule name, endpoint type, operating system type based on the attributes that you see to the right. And then the hardware manufacturer is Residio. Now, this is where the crowdsourcing comes into play. Now, AI/ML has already seen this Residio thermostat elsewhere in different customer plates. Now, it says that, hey, Mr. Customer, we have seen this Residio thermostat in different locations. Do you want to use it? So at this point, an admin actually can use it or change it. Now, if you change it, then it'll improve the efficacy because the admin doesn't think that this is a Residio for some reason, right? So this is how we increase the efficacy of AI/ML itself. And also the information that you present here would be shared and not your PII or PHI information. The label information would be shared with other customers. All the information that is sent to AI/ML is anonymized, encrypted at different levels, right? It is encrypted at rest, in motion, and all that. Now, once I complete this wizard, right, I'll be able to profile this endpoint, these endpoints in one shot. All these 812 endpoints. Okay, let me exit out of it. And in profiling rules, and you can see that we have around, this is a previous version, and we have around 1,600 rules. And right now, the current version has around 3,000 rules or so. We keep adding more and more profiling rules, and it's very dynamic. As and when we see newer set of IoT devices, and we'll be adding rules for that as well. And finally, we have an ability to create a hierarchy of devices, all endpoints. So yeah, this is a very easy and intuitive way of doing this. And it's just drag and drop. And, you have to drag these endpoints from right to the from left to the right. And then you can create new categories here. So here you can see that from at a higher level, this is all endpoints to IoT devices to cameras. Then I can drag and drop the camera from left to right. Okay. Now that's what endpoint analytics is, right? And then once the endpoint analytics consumes the information from DPI and other sources, it'll be able to profile, and it'll be able to share this information over to ICE. Now in ICE, and if we go to ICE, I think a lot of us are familiar with ICE context visibility section. If you go to the ICE context visibility section, endpoint classification, and there is this specific endpoint, and that I wanted to show you, right? And that's the endpoint we saw in endpoint analytics. And this is an IP phone, right? Now, when I click on this IP phone, you can see that I've already created a custom profile for this EA profile, the Cisco IP phone. I've named it intuitively as well. Now you can also see the asset attribution that I spoke about, right? Way down in the bottom. So you can see the asset attributes here. So the next step is for me to use these asset attributes in a custom profile and then use that in the authorization policy. Now, in the next release of DNA Center, this will be simplified, and you don't need to create a custom profile at all, because these attributes, there are other set of attributes. There is a specific group that we wanted to create in Shockwave, and that actually identifies these attributes in a slightly different way and not these attributes. And then these will be exposed in the authorization policy, and Dustin touched upon that. Now, if you go to ICE, in the profiling policy, you can see that I have created a profiling policy with a name, and then I had used these attributes. IoT asset vendor contains Cisco, and device type is IP phone, and the hardware revision is Cisco IP phone 9971. Remember, when you're creating a custom profile, the minimum certainty factor should be very high, and the certainty factor of the individual condition has to accumulate to this minimum certainty factor. And this is what ICE uses for profiling the endpoints. So once you create these custom profile, then you can go to the policies and I click on the authorization policy. You can see that, and there is a specific policy that I've added, right? And that uses a condition called endpoint policy equals EA profile Cisco IP phone. And I had also used an authorization profile and a security group. So you could push the permissions for this specific endpoint, mapping the custom profile, an authorization profile, and a security group, if you will. So that's all to it, right? Like once you once you turn on PX Grid in DNA Center and ICE, that does the magic for you. Over to Dustin. If you have any questions, and I'm happy to chat with you in the Q&A.
All right, thanks, Krishnan. Yeah, so hopefully seeing that demonstration of endpoint analytics and ICE in action will kind of help, clarify and allow you to visualize some of the concepts that we talked about, during the endpoint analytics overview. So with the couple minutes that we have remaining, I did want to touch on trust analytics. So if you recall, back at the beginning of our discussion today, I mentioned the three kind of common barriers to segmentation that we aim to remove with our different solutions. And let's finally talk about trust analytics. Again, trust analytics is part of endpoint analytics. It'll just be seen as a separate tab within the application. And this concept of trust analytics, again, what we want to do is help provide context and ongoing verification on the different endpoints on your network, right? So as you've hopefully seen by the demonstration and what we've talked about, endpoint analytics does an excellent job of profiling these devices and letting you know, okay, what is on my network? But we want to take it a step further and help you understand, are the endpoints that are on my network, are they trustworthy, right? Are they vulnerable? Are they, doing any anomalous behavior that could be concerning? So that is what we're trying to deliver and build into the product. And, I'll talk through this slide. I know it looks like a lot, but trust analytics functions very similarly to how endpoint analytics does. So if you remember, we have our various telemetry sources. We take those sources of information, we aggregate that information, and we calculate, for the purposes of endpoint analytics, we calculate a profile. And for trust analytics, we take these sources of data, and if you'll look in the center portion of the slide in the blue box, these are some of the telemetry and data sources that we plan on using in the product. And today, spoofing behavior at the top is the single functionality that we have deployed in the product today. So we're able to detect MAC address spoofing, and we're able to detect that, and then of course use that to ultimately provide a trust score for an endpoint. So from left to right, what you have happening is you have these endpoints on your network, they're communicating, and then utilizing these sources of data in the center portion of the slide, we aggregate that information, and then as a result, we produce a trust score for each of the endpoints on the network. And that score ranges from a 1 to 10, with 1 being the lowest and 10 being the highest. And the goal here is to provide you with an additional piece of context to create, segmentation policy. And in this example, we're going from we're bolstering the visibility-driven segmentation with, trust-based segmentation, and that this trust score is yet another attribute that you can use when creating your segmentation policy in ICE to better protect in your network and these particular devices. So, in terms of other sources of information that we're going to be building into the product, again, today we're able to use spoofing behavior to calculate that trust score. That is our single input and single, kind of variable that we use to determine the scoring. In the upcoming release of Shockwave and DNAC Fray, we will support open port scanning. So we'll support and be able to identify, say for instance, you have, CT scanners or other, critical endpoints on your network, and you want to ensure that they don't have a specific, range of ports or specific ports open on the device that could be used. You'll be able to scan for and identify that. And if, you identify any open ports that you've identified as malicious, then that'll calculate into the trust score. We'll be adding in functionality to do credential scanning, which I think I alluded to earlier on. So let's say you have an IP camera, and you can very easily go to Google and look up the manufacturer login credentials for that particular IP camera. So utilizing trust analytics, you'll be able to scan for those credentials and identify if any endpoints that you specify are using factory login credentials, because of course that prevents a very easy attack vector for a bad actor to get in and start causing problems on the network. So again, trust analytics, it operates in a very similar fashion. We aggregate a bunch of information, and we'll continue to add sources of information as we build the product out. And as an end result, we give you this trust score for each of the endpoints on your network that you can use to, again, create better segmentation policy. You can take action against endpoints that have low trust scores in endpoint analytics. One of the key things that customers talk to us and ask us about is, that's great. This information is great, but what can I do with it? You can use, a change of ANC policy in endpoint analytics to immediately take action and quarantine an endpoint that, in this example, let's say has a trust score of 1 to 3. So, we want to make sure that we're not only providing you information, but providing you as the user the ability to do something with that information. And you can do that both in endpoint analytics and, of course, in ICE. We'll quickly walk through an example of, what, in this example, spoofing behavior and how we're able to use machine learning to detect that. So within Trust Analytics, again, similar to the machine learning cloud that I spoke about earlier, we're able to build out profiles for how particular endpoints should act, right? And in this example, along the top of the slide, we have 2 different IP cameras that are connecting to the network, right? And since Endpoint Analytics has been able to profile, hundreds, if not thousands of IP cameras, we have a good understanding of what, how that particular endpoint typically behaves on the network. And in this example, the IP camera on the left is connected to the network, and we're able to identify that, yes, based on the way this endpoint is communicating on the network, it matches what we've typically seen, and we think that this is indeed an IP camera. However, on the right-hand side, we're able to look at the behavior model and identify, hey, this endpoint says that it's an IP camera, but based on its profile and its behavior, we're not seeing a match here, and we think that something anomalous is happening. So Endpoint Analytics will classify this as an anomaly and identify that, hey, some sort of spoofing behavior is occurring here. It will alert the admin and, of course, give you the option to use an ANC policy and take action on that particular endpoint. So that's just an overview of Trust Analytics. Again, if you're interested in learning more, about what it is and kind of, the value that we're delivering with it, please reach out to us and we can go into more detail and provide, even a demonstration for this as well, if that's something that you're interested in. So to wrap up, we did want to ask 2 additional poll questions, so given what we've discussed today and kind of what I just talked about with Trust Analytics, we'd like to understand how helpful would an endpoint trust score be, in your particular environment. So, given your role and responsibilities, is this something that you can see being helpful? If you were able to understand, how trustworthy a device was and had this score, and again, this would be another attribute that Endpoint Analytics would share with ICE. So would this be something that would be helpful to you when you're, in ICE and creating those policies? Okay, great. And given that, given this endpoint trust score, we'd also like to understand how might you use an endpoint trust score? And you can select all that apply here. And if you have another, response, please specify. But, would this be helpful to use an access control, assessing vulnerabilities, and just kind of building overall situational awareness on the network? Would you use it to resolve and contain issues on endpoints? Perhaps you wouldn't use it at all. That's a fair response as well. And then any other answer, please specify how you might use this endpoint trust score. Okay, great. I see that we're right on time, so I did want to call out some resources. I think Krishnan's already posted a lot of these in the chat, but if you're curious and want to learn more about endpoint analytics, these are some great resources. We have the Cisco website, white papers, and various case studies. Krishnan actually gave a very good presentation at Cisco Live this year around endpoints and are they trustworthy. So there's a link to that as well. But overall, I think we're right on time. So, happy to take any other questions. And, thank you for your time and your attendance. Hopefully you learned something about endpoint analytics and how it can help, you better utilize ICE.
All right. Thank you so much, Dustin. Let's see. I think we might be able to squeeze in maybe 1 or 2 questions, if that's okay with you, Dustin.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let me see. So one question that we have here, is DNA Center required to use AI endpoint analytics?
Yes, DNA Center is required to use endpoint analytics. So again, endpoint analytics is an application that resides on DNA Center. So you do need DNA Center and DNA Advantage licensing to deploy endpoint analytics.
Perfect, thank you. And last question here, what DNAC and ICE licensing are required to deploy an AI endpoint analytics?
Yeah, so for DNA Center, it'll be DNA Advantage, and then for ICE, it would be ICE Plus licensing.
Excellent, thank you so much. All right, so with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up our presentation for today. Dustin and Krishnan, I want to give you a very big thank you for speaking about endpoint analytics today with our audience. I hope that everyone found great value in the information and resources that were shared here today. I would also like to extend a very big thank you to each and every one of our panelists for lending a hand with all of the questions throughout the webinar. We really appreciate it. And just a quick reminder to our attendees that you're going to receive a short pop-up survey as soon as you exit the webinar. And we would be so grateful if you can just take a few minutes to complete it and let us know how you like today's presentation. We always look forward to receiving your valuable feedback. And again, for those of you who are interested in revisiting this session, we will have the recording available for on-demand viewing within about 5 business days after today. For your reference, I posted the link to our ICE training videos page in the chat window. That's where the recording will be located. However, you will also be receiving a follow-up email within the next 15 minutes that will contain that very same link. So please do keep an eye on your email inbox for that. And lastly, I do want to let our attendees know that we do have another ICE webinar coming up early next month on June 8th, and this is going to be covering ICE and AWS. So we do invite you to join us and register for this webinar on the same page, on the same ICE training videos page, if you haven't done so already. So we hope to see you there. Thanks again to our presenters, to our panelists, and to all of our attendees for joining us here live. I hope that you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.